A reading from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? There is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. This is the word of the Lord.
All right, thank you, Amber Rose. So let me get situated here. For the last few weeks, we have been looking at Old Testament books which talk about Israel's rebuilding efforts after decades in exile. Okay, so the world has been turned upside down, and Israel's finally back home. And they are facing the rubble of their old life, their old city, their old temple. Their homes are in ruins. Progress in rebuilding is slow going. A lot of their neighbors don't want them to succeed and rise to power again. For Israel, nothing seems to add up. And what they have to learn, and what we have to learn alongside them, is that we have to, you might say, rebuild our faith as we rebuild the rest of our lives. So what foundation are we building on going forward now that the world has shifted? What are our standards of success going forward? For Israel, to put it bluntly, they could either rebuild according to the old standards, the old ways, the past that they had now lost, which always seemed to lead to disappointment, yearning for nostalgia. Or they could rebuild with eyes of faith, not comparing the present to the past, not trying to remake what they had lost, but aiming for something brand new that God was working in their midst. And what they learn is that smaller does not mean less significant. Fewer in number does not mean weaker. Depending on their neighbors is not a failure. Weakness can mean surprising strength. So in our world, which also has shifted, just like for Israel, if we try to rebuild, if we try to go forward, trying to recreate the past, trying to get back all the things that we've lost, it'll never measure up. But if instead we rebuild, seeing with eyes of faith, God has so much in store for us. So this week we're going to learn another vital lesson about rebuilding, which is that rebuilding requires that we all take faithful risks. And we're going to learn from Nehemiah's example, whose faithful risk was world-changing. So let's look at his risk in two simple parts. Okay? First, we'll see his public grief. Second, his prayerful cooperation. Okay, I'll divide the scene that way. His public grief and his prayerful cooperation. So first, Nehemiah shows his grief in public. Look at verse 1 again. Nehemiah takes wine to give to the king and then says, "Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart.'" So the scene seems simple enough, doesn't it? Nehemiah is grieved. You can see it on his face. And the king says, "What's wrong?" But notice what happens next. Nehemiah says, "Then I was very much afraid." Now, why would that be? Why would his grief be such a big deal to the point where he'd be deathly afraid? Well, we get a few clues in the text. First, Nehemiah earlier has told us, just the verse before what we printed, that he was cupbearer to the king. Now, that does not mean that he was just serving food, that he was a food server, but a cupbearer in the ancient Near East was a significant court position. Here's how one commentator describes it. He says, royal cupbearers in antiquity, in addition to their skill in selecting and serving wine, and their duty in tasting it as proof against poison, were also expected to be convivial and tactful companions to the king. So they were meant to bring wisdom, to be a good member of the party. Being much in the king's confidence, they could thus wield considerable influence by way of informal counsel and discussion. So they turned into very trusted advisors. We also learned that cupbearers were often called advisors. They were sometimes involved in the treasury, in the king's guard. They could be in charge of that too. So partly due to his job, Nehemiah wasn't really allowed to be sad in public. He couldn't really draw attention to himself with his own emotions. He, in this case at least, had to be convivial, had to bring life to the party. It seems like it was some kind of feast, a banquet. There was wine. So think of the irony and think of the risk as Nehemiah is handing the king the joys of wine while risking showing his grief in public. But there's more than that. There's another reason why grief can be such a big deal and why it was here. And this is what I want to drive home for us all now. See, any kind of grief calls the present order into question. Any kind of grief is a sort of critique of the status quo, isn't it? See, when you bring your grief to the surface, you're saying things are not as they ought to be, and that's why you're upset about it. It's kind of like this happens, I think, to all of us. You have two people in a relationship, friendship, or something else, and some strain develops between you and the other person. Maybe you don't say anything about it, they don't. Maybe you don't even admit it to yourself, but you know that there's just some awkwardness there. You go on, you pretend like nothing's wrong, and then what hopefully happens is someone breaks down. Maybe there's just a tear, or maybe they text you and say, hey, next time we're together, can we talk? You know, what happens? The grief is made public. Now, the grief is a way of saying things are not right. Okay, it's a critique of the status quo. And that's what happened with Nehemiah. And not only was he saying, things are not okay, king, but in a sense, he was saying to the king, your rule is not okay. There's something wrong with the way you're doing your job as the king. See, in fact, Jerusalem, which is what Nehemiah is so upset about, right, is in ruins. And this is part of the king's territory. Not only that, if you read in the book of Ezra, which is kind of like Nehemiah's companion book, written very close together in history, we learn that this same king had, for political reasons, halted the rebuilding efforts in Jerusalem. So this is about as close as Nehemiah can get to issuing a critique of the king's policies. You know, your city, in your territory, is in ruins. You know, he was clever though, wasn't he? Long live the king, you know, my people are in disarray, my city's in ruins. You know, he's very clever, very tactful. And yet this is a result of the king's policies. So you begin to see why his grief was so risky. Why when he showed it, when the king saw it written on his face, he was very much afraid. You know, the pressure for Nehemiah must have been incredibly intense to put on a happy face, to just go with the flow, to maintain the status quo. After all, the king defined the status quo. He was in charge of, he defined reality. Let's pause there for a moment. I wonder if you ever feel like that you have to put on the pretense of being happy, with being content, just going with the flow. You know, you find this in a number of, it's not uncommon to find this in families, in entire companies, or at least teams at work, in groups of friends, where the unwritten rule around here is we don't get sad. Yeah. We don't show our grief, you know. And why is that? Well, one reason, maybe the main reason, is because when you grieve, you're issuing a critique. You're saying things are not right. And some people don't want you to say that because it might make them look bad. It might lead to them losing some control. Grief is risky. But what's the risk of not showing our grief? What's the risk of not going public with it? Well, we sort of limp along between this vague upsetness about the status quo and maintaining the status quo. If we don't do anything about it, we're just kind of caught limping along. Not liking the status quo, but still kind of maintaining it. And if you don't bring your grief out, if you don't make it public, even just to yourself, you may not even know it's really there. It may be doing things in your life, it may be popping out in all kinds of ways, and you may not know it. You may not know what the source of that is. I think God is inviting us to probe our griefs. Because if we do, if you air them, if you process them, if you get them out, you're going to discover that inside of them, buried in them, is a wish, is a desire, is a dream of a world that's organized differently, a dream of your life going differently. This is why, by the way, God in the Bible so often guides his people through their griefs, through the valley of the shadow of death, through this vale of tears. The king is wise. The king understands this, that inside your grief is a wish. Nehemiah, when he shows his grief and the king's like, what's wrong? Nehemiah tells him, this is what's wrong. And then what does the king say? What are you requesting? Verse 4. Nehemiah hadn't asked for anything, but the king understands that if you're grieving, you must want something. That's why you're upset. You want things to be different. So let's sit with this for just a moment longer before we go to the second and final thing Nehemiah does. What are you grieving, each of you here? Some of you might say, well, isn't it obvious? Aren't we all kind of grieving the same things? Even in our own city, tens of thousands of lives lost before their time. The economy is in a bit of a disarray. If you have kids, what's school going to look like? How are you going to handle that? People feeling burnt out about virtual work. People wondering if there's going to be work going forward. This is not news to any of you. And yet, I do want to invite each of you to ask yourself, what is your grief? What are you upset about as all this has changed? Have you told anyone? Have you told yourself? Have you put words to it? Because if you do, it will help to lead you to the wishes of your heart. There's a wish, there's a dream, there's a hope of something else buried in your griefs. Let me just push us one more way. Nehemiah's griefs are not just shared publicly, but they're about public things. Nehemiah is not just wrapped up in his own world, his own private concerns, but he's grieved about something else, something outside of him. Jerusalem, my people. It's in disarray. I need to do something about it. So I wonder, your grief, is it just about your own private affairs? Or is it about something else? Nehemiah is grieving his people. It impacts him, of course. But as you're grieving now, as you're processing all that's gone on the last several months, are you mostly concerned about how it's impacted you or are other people involved? Is your grief, does it have a public dimension to it? Are you grieved about what's going on with your neighbors, with your neighborhood, with the city, with other people in your life? Nehemiah has public grief. Second, though, what is this faithful risk he takes? He grieves publicly. Second, he prayerfully cooperates. Nehemiah moves to prayerful cooperation. He doesn't just grieve, but he acts. And the sort of tense, decisive, sort of dramatic scene that we get in this passage is really the tip of the iceberg of, in fact, 4 months of praying, of planning, of wrestling, of fasting and weeping, and just yearning for something to change as he hears news of his city back home. And so this is just the tip of the iceberg. He's not just being impulsive and going, now's my chance. God help me. Like sometimes we do. God bless my plans. No, this is months in the making. Nehemiah embodies so well This idea that we totally depend on God for everything, for all the breakthroughs that we are dreaming of. And yet, that does not leave Nehemiah where he is. He doesn't just kick back and say, okay, I prayed, let's see what God's going to do. It gets him going, it gets him acting, it gets him out into the world, taking bold risks, right? So let's zoom in on the prayer part of prayerful cooperation. Nehemiah really quick says, when he's put on the spot by the king, then I said a prayer to the God of heaven, right? Now that's interesting because pretty much all of chapter 1 of Nehemiah is probably a summary of his prayer the last 4 months, right? So Nehemiah, it's really interesting that he says he prayed to the God of heaven because all throughout the Bible, we see that what happens in heaven impacts what happens on earth, you might say. In other words, God's involved in the workings of this world. This is countercultural today to say that. The cultural air that we all breathe kind of says, it's fine if you have a private devotional life. That's great you go to church. I hope that helps you, right? Oh, it's so nice that your church prays and sings and believes that God hears you. But certainly, you can't bring God into the public square, or certainly God's not involved in the inner workings of this world. But that's not what Nehemiah thinks. Nehemiah understands that what goes on in heaven, so to speak, influences what goes on in this world. God is involved in everything, working all things according to his will. There's a line in Psalm 119 where the psalmist says to God, all things are your servants. That's interesting. All things are your servants, and he means all things. See, Nehemiah prays, but it's a prayerful cooperation. It's a prayer that propels him out into the world, but not alone. It's cooperation. So all along, Israel's rebuilding efforts, the years of sort of halted efforts, fits of starting and stopping, all along the way, members of the faith community involve the watching world. Sometimes this is against their will, as the watching world sort of looks at them with suspicion, tries to impede their efforts. But other times, like in our scene today, Israel needs the world's help. See, Nehemiah needs the king to send him back and to fund the rebuilding of Jerusalem. This is very often the case when the church is scattered, you might say. God scatters his people throughout different empires of the region, and they're exiled, right? But it's also a way of God getting them out there into the world, getting his word out, getting his people out so that the world can see what people of faith are like, what it's like to be in a reconciled relationship with God. You know what this does? It means that the church learns to become less self-sufficient. They learn that they have to start depending on their neighbors. They are less a sort of fortress unto themselves, self-sufficient, doing all their own things. It gets them out. It scatters them. It's God's way of getting the message out. There's this example in the Gospels where Jesus is preparing 70 of his followers to go out into the world and surrounding villages and towns and to preach and to minister, to heal. And I wonder how they receive this when he tells them, but he says, don't take anything with you. Take no resources, no money, no nothing. And he says, instead, rely on the hospitality of the places that I send you. Isn't that interesting? That's a ministry that costs $0, by the way. We should look into that, right? He says, don't bring any resources with you, but when you go, rely on your neighbors. If they take you in, stay with them. If they feed you, receive that food. And in a sense, when Jesus sends them out, the people that he sends them to didn't believe. That's why Jesus sent them. So it's very much the same as what's happening with Nehemiah. This gets at the idea of what you might hear called common grace. God does not just bless and give gifts and insight and skill and wisdom and goodwill to people who believe, but he gives it to the whole world. He scatters it like seed over all of humanity. Okay. So let me ask you this. Where is your grief leading you? That was our first question. But more pointedly, who is it leading you to talk to? as we all sort of look forward to rebuilding life together, who can you cooperate with? Who could you work with? Who could you reach out to and say, I need you. I need you for this. Back in March, when the shutdown began, Alan Hirsch, who is working with Redeemer City to City, he's a missiologist. So generally speaking, someone who theorizes and strategizes for the church broadly, looking at how the church grows, how it changes, how it's grown and shrank over time. He was asked, how can the church respond now that all of our routines are disrupted? We can't gather on Sundays. And I'll summarize what he said. He said, if you just look around you right now, wherever you're scattered, you are in a mission field. Missionaries are not just Christians that get sent far away. They can be wherever you are. Wherever you are is a sort of mission field, he said. And so what can you do? Thinking that way? Thinking that God has sent you to wherever you are? Put it really simply, he said, find out something in your neighborhood that's not going well, something that's broken, something where there's a gap, where you could step in. He says, find someone who agrees with you, and then just do something about it. It's as simple as that. What's wrong? Who agrees with you? And then do something about it. Look, you could do that today. You could start that today. Remarkably, when Nehemiah appeals to the king, he's actually doing the king a favor. It is in the king's best interests to rebuild Jerusalem because this is part of his territory, and some have said that maybe Egypt at this time was rising in power, and Jerusalem could have been like a strong Western bloc to block Egypt's rise. Whatever the case may be, this is in the king's best interest. And Nehemiah is so tactful in how he broaches this issue with the king, with his neighbor. He says, long live the king. He reveres him. He says, it's my problem, basically. My people, my ancestors' graves are desecrated. And anyone at that time, especially royalty, would have been just gripped by the idea that, your ancestors' graves are in ruins. We got to do something about that. That was a common value that they shared. And Nehemiah needs his neighbor to rebuild, to go forward. I think we do too. And to tie it all together, Nehemiah prayerfully cooperates with his neighbor. He needs his non-believing neighbor to rebuild. I just think it's astounding that this pagan king would essentially fund the rebuilding of Jerusalem, of their walls, of the temple where Israel hoped God would one day again dwell with his people. This king funds that project. Incredible how God involves the whole world in his work. So how will you act? Where is your grief leading you? And who is God calling you to talk to work with, to act with, to start remedying this? Who do you need help to rebuild? Just one final word on the results that Nehemiah sees. And this is, I think, maybe the most encouraging thing. Basically, all of these efforts, from what I can read, go a lot better than Nehemiah expected. Did you notice that Nehemiah's nervous, right? So he's wondering if it's going to go well. Okay, so there's some doubt. But once the king says, okay, you can go do this rebuilding, what does Nehemiah do? Okay, great. No, he says, okay, let me step up my request. He says, can you fund me? Isn't that amazing? Can you underwrite the rebuilding of an entire city, please? Amazing. He also asks for letters for basically permission, safe passage through the territories around Jerusalem. How does Nehemiah process this? The last verse that we printed. The king granted me what I asked for the king was so generous. No, he says, the king granted what I asked for the good hand of my God was upon me. All along the way, God is this, the third party. It's not just Nehemiah and the king having to negotiate. God is there. God is working. God's hand sees this through. And this is usually how God works, isn't it? Going above and beyond what we can think or ask. I can imagine that Nehemiah thought, I'm going to walk out of this with a deal where the king not only sends me but funds everything. I can't imagine he thought that, maybe. Nevertheless, God goes above and beyond. There's a superabundance with God, not scarcity. Outdoing our expectations. Now, I wish, myself included, I wish we could all just let this sink in to our hearts as we relate to God, that we cannot out-ask him. You can't out-ask him. You can't go to God and say, I'm going to see if I can out-ask what you're willing to give, what you're willing to do. You know, your dreams are not bigger than God's dreams for your life, for your neighborhood, for this church. You know, God's attention, his resources are not divided like ours tend to be. So that if you get something, or if that person gets something, your share is less. No, that's not how God works. We're not lobbying God to get like a slice of the budget. God doesn't have a budget. God doesn't have those kinds of limitations. As a church, let's close this way. Let's consider Jesus for a moment. Jesus is a sort of Nehemiah. This is how Tim Keller puts it. He puts it better than I can. He has a chapter in a book on Nehemiah. And he points out at the beginning of that chapter that this Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah is pointing to an ultimate Nehemiah. This is Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate one who was in the palace. And he was completely safe, much like Nehemiah was before he risked. Jesus is the ultimate Nehemiah who was in the palace, completely safe, and he left all of that to go out into danger to identify with his people. Jesus Christ, the ultimate Nehemiah, identified with us, not at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life, to make us citizens of the ultimate city. That's who Jesus is. And you know what? When Jesus enlists you in his great project, just like Nehemiah enlists the king, he is not just renewing a city that was in rubble. He is involving you in a project of renewing body and soul and spirit and relationships and neighborhoods and eventually the whole world. And I find this fascinating. You know, when Nehemiah goes to the king, there's obviously a power imbalance, right? He is enlisting the king's favor. That's his neighbor. And the king agrees. But with Jesus, there's a great reversal, isn't there? If Nehemiah enlisted the king, Jesus comes to us as the king and enlists us, imperfect though we are, in this great project. And that should be incredibly relieving to us as we contemplate, God, where are you sending me? What are the faithful risks you are calling me to take as we rebuild, as we go forward, as we serve our neighbors? This is Jesus' project. He has enlisted you. Why is that relieving? Well, I love to think of the Christian life as following Jesus. You might say, I'm a Jesus follower. I follow Jesus. You know what that means? That wherever you are right now, he's led you there. That should be a little relieving, right? You know, you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, like the psalmist says. It's because Jesus led you there. He's got something in store for you. You know, you're elated, you're getting these breakthroughs. It's because he's led you there. He's always right in front of you. That's incredibly relieving because you don't have to bear all the burden yourself for this life, for what God calls you to do. This is his project. He's going to see it through. If you've ever had someone in your life who has some position of influence or authority, and they are really out for you. They want to see you through. They want to protect you. They are not afraid to take the hit for you. That is so relieving, isn't it? It's so emboldening to have someone like that in your life who is in front of you. Christian, that's who Jesus is for you. You are following him. This work of rebuilding after the world has been turned upside down, this is his work. And he involves us by grace. And he's going to see to it that the job gets done. Right. So may we take faithful risks in his name. He took the ultimate faithful risk for us. So surely we can take smaller faithful risks for him. Why don't we pray? Our Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for Nehemiah, and especially the one to whom Nehemiah points, Jesus, who left the comforts of your presence, of your throne, the safety of that, and came into this world as a king in disguise, a king that we did not recognize at first, a king whose rule is not of this world. What an amazing thing, God, to be wrapped up in this great project of rebuilding. You are sovereign over all things, God, and we trust you for that. And we do pray, God, that you would equip us, encourage us, embolden us to take faithful risks in Jesus' name. For we follow him in doing so. He goes before us. So, God, we commit ourselves and our lives and our future to you. In his name, amen. Amen.